Today we're going to reveal 7 beer brands that Australians need to stop drinking immediately. Look, we're talking about those beers you see at every bottle-o, every pub, every servo, the ones with the iconic labels and the massive advertising campaigns. The ones you've been drinking since you were 18 because that's what your mates drink, that's what your old man drinks, that's what gets advertised during the footy. We've been trained to believe that the big brands, the household names, must be quality because they're everywhere. That their beer is pure, natural, just barley, hops, yeast and water, like beer's supposed to be. But here's what the beer industry desperately doesn't want you to know. Most commercial Australian beer is loaded with additives, preservatives and cheap adjuncts that have nothing to do with traditional brewing. We're talking high fructose corn syrup, propylene glycol, artificial flavors and preservatives that cause those shocking hangovers you thought were just part of drinking. Number 7. Carlton Draft. Let's start with one of Australia's most iconic beers. Carlton Draft is everywhere, every pub, every bottle shop, every Aussie barbecue. At $1.50-$55 for a case of 24, it seems like decent value for a mainstream lager. But Carlton Draft is made by Carlton United Breweries, now owned by Asahi, a Japanese corporation. Since Asahi took over, the recipe has been quietly cheapened. The beer is brewed using a significant proportion of adjuncts rice and corn instead of 100% malted barley. These adjuncts are cheaper than barley malt and create a lighter, blander beer. Traditional lager should be 100% malt. Carlton Draft is probably 60 to 70% malt, with the rest being rice and corn. This is why it tastes thin and watery with minimal flavor. What makes Carlton Draft particularly problematic is the additives. The beer contains propylene glycol as a stabilizer. This is the same chemical used in antifreeze. While it's considered safe in small amounts, it's not a traditional brewing ingredient. They also use isinglass, fish bladder, for fining, which isn't disclosed on the label. The beer is heavily filtered and pasteurized, which removes flavor along with any beneficial compounds. At $2.20 per bottle, you're paying for a brand name and nostalgia, not quality beer. The massive advertising during AFL games and cricket keeps Carlton Draft in people's minds, but it's industrial lager with minimal malt and chemical additives. Number 6. Victoria Bitter. VB is probably Australia's most iconic beer, hard-earned thirst and all that. At $1.50-$55 for a case, it's the same price as Carlton Draft because they're made by the same company. VB has the same problems as Carlton Draft rice and corn adjuncts, chemical additives, heavy processing. But VB is actually worse because it's marketed as a full-strength bitter when it's only 4.9% alcohol and barely has any bitterness. Real bitter beer should have significant hop bitterness. VB tastes of almost nothing, just slight sweetness and alcohol. What makes VB particularly offensive is the nationalistic marketing. The hard-earned thirst campaign, the Australian imagery, the association with tradies and hard work, it's all designed to make you think VB is authentic Australian beer. But it's owned by a Japanese corporation and made with cheap adjuncts and additives. The recipe has been modified multiple times over the years, always getting cheaper and blander. At $2.20 per bottle, VB is terrible value. You're paying for decades of marketing that convinced Australians this is what beer should taste like. It's not. Real beer has flavor, aroma, and character. VB has none of these. Number 5. XXXX Gold. XXXX Gold is Queensland's favourite beer, but it's absolute rubbish. At $1.45-$50 for a case, it's slightly cheaper than VB or Carlton Draft. There's a reason it's mid-strength beer at 3.5% alcohol, which means even less malt and more adjuncts. XXXX Gold is probably 50% malt and 50% rice corn. The taste is like lightly flavoured water with a bit of alcohol. What makes XXXX Gold particularly problematic is it's marketed as a session beer, something you can drink all day in the Queensland heat. This encourages excessive consumption of nutritionally empty beer. The beer contains the same chemical additives as other cub beers, propylene glycol, preservatives, and clarifying agents. It's heavily filtered and pasteurized until there's virtually no flavor left. XXXX Gold also contains high fructose corn syrup to add body and sweetness that's been removed by using adjuncts instead of malt. You're literally drinking corn syrup beer. At $2 per bottle, XXXX Gold is cheap for a reason. It's industrial mid-strength lager with minimal real ingredients. Queenslanders drink it because it's everywhere and the marketing is relentless. But it's terrible beer that's training palates to expect flavourless, watery beer as normal. Number 4. Tooheys New. Tooheys New is NSWA's answer to VB the working man's beer, the tradie's choice. At $1.50-$55 for a case, it's standard mainstream pricing, but Tooheys is made by Lion, owned by Kirin, another Japanese corporation, and suffers from the same industrial brewing problems. The beer uses significant rice and corn adjuncts, probably 40% of the grain bill. This creates a thin, bland beer with minimal malt character. Tooheys New also contains caramel colouring to make it look darker and more substantial than it actually is. Natural beer colour comes from the malt. If you're adding caramel colouring, you're compensating for lack of real malt. The beer contains preservatives including sodium benzoate, which has been linked to allergic reactions and hyperactivity. It's also heavily filtered and pasteurized, removing any character. What makes Tooheys particularly frustrating is NSW has a rich brewing history. Sydney was once home to dozens of independent breweries making quality beer. Now it's dominated by Tooheys, which is industrial lager owned by a foreign corporation. At $2.20 per bottle, you're paying mainstream prices for below-average beer. The only reason Tooheys survives is brand loyalty and massive marketing spend. Number 3. Hahn Super Dry. Hahn Super Dry is marketed as premium beer for sophisticated drinkers. The sleek bottle, the super dry positioning, the higher price point, it's all designed to make you think this is quality beer. At $1.55-$60 for a case, you're paying a premium. But Hahn Super Dry is made by Lion, same as Tooheys, and it's industrial lager with marketing pretensions. The super dry process involves fermenting the beer longer to convert more sugars to alcohol, creating a drier, higher alcohol beer, 4.6%. But to make this process work with their cheap ingredient base, they use enzymes and additives. The beer contains rice and corn adjuncts like all industrial lagers. What makes Hahn Super Dry particularly problematic is the additives to create the super dry character. They use amylase enzymes to break down more starches into fermentable sugars. These enzymes aren't natural to brewing, they're industrial additives. The result is beer that tastes thin and alcoholic with minimal malt sweetness. It's marketed to young urban drinkers who think they're drinking something premium. You're not. You're drinking industrial lager with enzyme additives and clever marketing. At $2.40 per bottle, Hahn Super Dry is overpriced for what it is. You could buy actual premium beer from craft breweries for the same price. Number 2. Pure Blonde. Pure Blonde is marketed as healthy beer, low carb, 85% less carbs than regular beer, designed for health-conscious drinkers. At $1.55-$60 for a case, you're paying premium prices. But Pure Blonde is one of the most heavily processed beers in Australia. To create low-carb beer, they use enzymes to break down complex carbohydrates into simple sugars that ferment completely. This creates beer with minimal residual carbs, but also minimal body and flavor. To compensate for the thin, bland result, Pure Blonde contains multiple additives, artificial sweeteners to add perceived body, hop extracts instead of actual hops, and preservatives. The beer is ultra-filtered and heavily processed. What makes Pure Blonde particularly deceptive is the health halo. Low carb sounds healthy, but the additives and processing make it less healthy than regular beer. The artificial sweeteners may be calorie-free, but they're still artificial chemicals. And because it's 4.6% alcohol, you're still consuming the same alcohol as regular beer. The calories from alcohol are the same. At $2.40 per bottle, Pure Blonde is expensive processed beer marketed to people who want to feel virtuous about drinking. You're not being healthy, you're drinking heavily processed industrial beer with additives. Number 1. Corona Extra. Corona became hugely popular in Australia through clever marketing, the beach lifestyle, the lime wedge, the clear bottle showing pure beer. At $1.60-65 for a case, it's expensive, but Corona is terrible beer. First, it's made by Grupo Modelo in Mexico and imported to Australia. That means it's been sitting in shipping containers and warehouses for months. Beer is a fresh product that degrades over time. By the time Corona reaches Australia, it's often months old. Second, the clear glass bottle is the worst possible packaging for beer. Light causes beer to skunk. UV light reacts with hop compounds to create a skunky, unpleasant flavor. This is why most beer comes in brown bottles or cans to protect from light. Corona's clear bottle is purely for marketing, and the beer suffers. That distinctive Corona taste that people recognize, that's partially skunked beer. Third, Corona is made with adjuncts rice and corn, creating thin, watery beer. The beer has minimal hop bitterness and malt character. It's bland, skunky lager that needs a lime wedge to mask the off flavors. What makes Corona particularly offensive is the price. At $2.60 per bottle, you're paying import prices for mediocre Mexican lager that's been sitting in clear bottles for months. The only reason Corona is popular is marketing. It's terrible beer at premium prices. Here's what you need to understand about the Australian beer industry. It's dominated by two massive corporations: Carlton United Breweries, owned by Asahi, and Lion, owned by Kirin. These two companies control about 85% of the Australian beer market. They're Japanese corporations who bought Australian breweries, kept the iconic Australian brand names, and quietly cheapened the recipes to maximize profits. The beer you're drinking isn't the same beer your grandfather drank. It's been reformulated with cheaper ingredients, more adjuncts, and more additives. Australian beer regulations are pathetically weak. Breweries don't have to list ingredients on beer labels. They only have to state alcohol content and volume. This means all the adjuncts, additives, and processing aids are completely hidden from consumers. Beer can contain rice, corn, high fructose corn syrup, propylene glycol, caramel coloring, preservatives, enzymes, and clarifying agents, and none of it has to be disclosed. This lack of transparency allows industrial breweries to cut costs while maintaining the illusion of traditional brewing. The health implications are real. Chemical additives cause worse hangovers. Propylene glycol, preservatives, and other additives contribute to the headache, nausea, and fatigue. Adjuncts like rice and corn create beer that's nutritionally empty, just alcohol and calories with no beneficial compounds. High fructose corn syrup creates blood sugar spikes. Artificial flavors and colors in flavored beers have unknown long-term health effects. And the sheer sugar content in alcopops is contributing to obesity and metabolic disease in young Australians. So what should you drink instead? Here are the only beer brands that are actually safe. Number 1. Stonewood Pacific Ale. Stonewood from Byron Bay makes exceptional craft beer. At $1.70-75 for a case, it's more expensive than mainstream beer. But this is genuine craft beer made properly. Pacific Ale is brewed with 100% Australian malted barley, Australian Galaxy hops, and nothing else. No adjuncts, no additives, no processing chemicals. The beer is unfiltered, which means it's cloudy and full of flavor. The Galaxy hops give it tropical fruit flavors: passion fruit, mango, citrus. It's refreshing, flavorful, and balanced. Stonewood is independently owned and committed to sustainability. They use renewable energy, recycle their water, and support local farmers. The brewery is B Corp certified, meaning they meet rigorous standards for environmental and social performance. At $3 per bottle, Pacific Ale is more expensive than mainstream beer, but you're paying for real craft beer made with quality ingredients by an ethical company. This is what Australian beer should be: flavorful, refreshing, made locally with Australian ingredients. Number 2. Balter XPA. Balter from the Gold Coast makes excellent craft beer. At $1.65-70 for a case, it's mid-premium pricing. Their XPA Extra Pale Ale is brewed with 100% malted barley, American hops, and traditional brewing methods. No adjuncts, no additives, minimal processing. The beer is full-flavored with tropical fruit and citrus hop character. What makes Balter special is it was founded by surfers including Mick Fanning, world champion surfer. They're committed to making quality beer and supporting the local community. The beer is fresh brewed, packaged and sold quickly. No sitting in warehouses for months like imports. At $2.80 per bottle, Balter XPA is good value for craft beer. You're getting fresh, flavorful beer made by an Australian company that cares about quality. Number 3. Little Creatures Pale Ale. Little Creatures from Fremantle was one of Australia's first craft breweries. Yes, they're now owned by Lion, which is owned by Kirin, but they've maintained their brewing standards and recipe. At $65.70 for a case, it's craft beer pricing. Little Creatures Pale Ale is brewed with 100% malted barley and American Cascade hops. The beer is full-flavoured, properly bitter, and has actual hop aroma. This is what pale ale should taste like. While the corporate ownership is concerning, Little Creatures has maintained quality. The Fremantle Brewery still operates as a craft brewery. The recipe hasn't been cheapened, and the beer is still good. At $2.80 per bottle, Little Creatures is accessible craft beer that's widely available. If you can't find Stonewood or Balter, Little Creatures is an acceptable alternative. Stop supporting foreign corporations that cheapened Australian beer. Stop drinking chemical additives and adjuncts. Buy from independent Australian breweries making real beer with real ingredients. Cooper's, Stonewood, Balter, Bentspoke, Batch, Fixation. There are dozens of excellent Australian craft breweries making proper beer. If this video opened your eyes to what's really in mainstream Australian beer, smash that like button right now. Share this with every beer drinker. You know, most Australians have no idea they're drinking adjuncts and additives. Subscribe to the channel because I'm exposing more beverage industry frauds. Hit the bell icon so you don't miss the next video. And drop a comment below telling me which beer brand surprised you the most, or if you're switching to craft beer. I read every single comment. Together we're going to demand better from the Australian beer industry. Thanks for watching, and drink real beer, not chemical lager.